Blog theory. Feedback and capture in the circuits of Drive-Polity. By Jodi Dean. 2010. Chapter 4. Affective Networks. Section 1. Why are blogs often portrayed as inflicted on the rest of us? Are the rest of us, everyone else in the entire world, really victims of what is written on a single blog, in a single post, in a single thread? Or has the world somehow become the victim of bloggers, and not just of some specific blog, blogger, or group of bloggers, but bloggers in the abstract? What sort of world does this anxiety about bloggers presuppose or imagine? The language of victimization in the face of bloggers inflicting their boring lives, their obsessive lives, their sex lives, their pets' lives on the rest of us differs from the criticism of rabid political bloggers or snarky celebrity bloggers all working round the clock to attack their specific targets and generally amplify and intensify the circuits of communicative capitalism. The difference is that the anxiety about victimization construes blogging per se as an activity that victimizes and harms regardless of any particular content. The practice of blogging itself is harmful. Harm is an embedded feature of the application, like a link or tag. Anxiety about blogging relies on an image of the world as a communicative one, a world wherein communication is ubiquitous and fragile, dangerous yet unavoidable. That bloggers are blogging is a fact of this world that one cannot escape. The claim that blogging is harmful, that the rest of us are its victims, thus points to a crucial feature of blogging: it causes anxiety. Jacques Lacan associates the affect that is anxiety with jouissance, with the surplus enjoyment he designates as objet. Although anxiety seems to have no object, and thus differs from a fear or phobia, Lacan argues that it has to be approached in terms of objet, in terms, that is, of surplus enjoyment. Anxiety about blogging, then, is anxiety about enjoyment. In the preceding chapter, I present whatever being as a way to think about contemporary mediated subjects, although they can just as easily be designated as objects. In this chapter, I attend to the feedback loops, the circuits of drive, in which they are stuck. Without stable points of symbolic identification, whatever beings oscillate between the imaginary and the real, crafting their ever-adaptable, morphing, identities even as they remain threatened and vulnerable to the success, presence, and enjoyment of others. Communicative capitalism commands us to enjoy, at the same time that it reminds us that we aren't enjoying enough, as much, or as well as others are. Our enjoyment remains fragile, risky. Slavoj Žižek describes the way enjoyment constitutes itself as stolen, or as present and possible only insofar as one is deprived of it. I would have read a serious novel, cultivated an organic garden, driven senior citizens to the polls if I hadn't gotten caught up in those stupid blogs. Why are all those people blogging, anyway? What makes their lives and experiences so much more interesting than mine? If bloggers weren't inflicting their stupid stuff on the rest of us would be enjoying. We would be honing our writing, not reading the half-assed thoughts of idiots. We'd be making art, not looking at stupid cat videos. We'd be spending time with our family, not chatting with strangers on blogs. Blaming our failure to enjoy on bloggers thus compensates us for our failure by promising that were it not for the bloggers we would enjoy. Our failure, our insecurity, is not our fault. The language of infliction rests on the premise of fragile whatever beings threatened by the presence and enjoyment of others, preoccupied with the worry that others' lives are more meaningful and fun than their own. When they read our blogs and discover that our lives are really not worth the time it took to read about them, then they are furious, outraged. Why did you bloggers waste my time? The theft of enjoyment positions enjoyment as an object of desire, allowing us to fantasize that we would actually prefer to be reading literary tomes, laboring in a weedy garden, and participating in a political process designed to ensure that political change never occurs. It postpones our confrontation with drive. Confident in what we would prefer to do, if only we could, we overlook what we are actually doing. There's no way I spend 3 hours a day on mafia wars. It's important for me to tweet my reaction to the debate. The fantasy of enjoyment covers over the fact that we are already enjoying, that we get off, just a little bit, in and through our multiple, repetitive, mediated interactions. Through that fantasy, we screen ourselves from the real of our enjoyment, the enjoyment that we can't avoid, even if we don't want it. Blog anxiety, then, expresses our anxiety in the face of our enjoyment. We are captured doing not what we want but what we must. The upshot is that we are more entrapped after the announcement of the death of blogging than we ever were while it ostensibly lived. Then blogging was an alternative. Now it's another unavoidable element of our ubiquitous media setting. Section 2. German media theorist Friedrich Kittler begins his influential book Gramophone, Film, Typewriter with optical fiber networks in order to get to an end. Before the end, something is coming to an end. The end, for Kittler, is in part an end of differentiation among forms of media storage and transmission, more specifically, the differentiation between image, text, and voice. Digitization brings this end about. Instead of wiring people and technologies, absolute knowledge will be an endless loop. I've been describing blogging's setting in communicative capitalism in terms of endless loops. Kittler's absolute knowledge coincides with our confrontation with an inability to know, our fundamental uncertainty regarding what is happening, will happen, and has happened, a confrontation we experience in and as capture in the repetitive circuits of Drive. A non-event on Christmas Day 2009 can illustrate the way abundant information degenerates possibilities for meaning. A Nigerian student, Umar Farouk Abdulmutalab, attempted to blow up Northwest Airlines Flight 253 over the city of Detroit. He was able to get past airport security by hiding the explosives in his underwear. Coverage of the failed bombing in the days after it didn't occur pointed out the numerous clues that should have alerted officials into preventing Abdulmutalab from boarding the plane. These included the fact that Abdulmutalab's father had notified the U.S. Embassy in Nigeria that his son was missing and likely under the influence of religious extremists based in Yemen, that he was listed in the terrorist identities data mart environment, and that a communications intercept of al-Qaeda followers in Yemen indicated that a man named Umar Farouk had volunteered for an operation. Explanations for the security breach blamed too much information as well as an inability to access and analyze the information gathered. All the data in the world, as if such a fantasy of static completion were even possible, are useless without a question to cut through and organize them. Apparently, CIA computer systems cannot easily search automatically, and repeatedly, for possible links. According to the chair of the House Science and Technology Committee's Investigation and Oversight Subcommittee, Railhead, a program supposed to provide the National Counterterrorism Center with an integrated information infrastructure, is plagued by so many design errors that not only does it fail to connect the dots, it can't find the dots. To return to Kittler, he treats the distinctions between image, text, and voice in terms of the Lacanian registers of the imaginary, symbolic, and real. Lacan's registers, he tells us, are in fact an historical effect of changes in storage technologies. The imaginary consists in the cuts and illusions that comprise fantasies of wholeness, be they fantasies incited before a mirror or on the screen. The symbolic is typing, the machinic word in all its technicity. The real is recorded sound, inclusive of the hisses and noise accompanying the vocals produced by a larynx. Digitization erases the distinctions between visual, written, and acoustic media. It turns all data into numbers that can be stored, transmitted, copied, computed, and rearranged. Taking the place of the material differences providing the basic structure of Lacanian psychoanalysis is the feedback loop. Kittler writes, a simple feedback loop, and information machines bypass humans, their so-called inventors. Computers themselves become subjects. The codes and computations of machinic circuits thus herald an end, the end of so-called man. Contra Kittler, we're not there yet, and it doesn't look like we'll get there from here. The affective networks of communicative capitalism indicate that machines are not terminating humans. On the contrary, cybernetic circuits don't exclude humans, they connect them. Computers don't need emoticons to help them access the feeling of a message. It's almost as if Kittler remains more of a humanist than he wants to admit. His technology cryptograms, surface wave filters, computational devices, and fiber optic cables rest on an underlying fantasy if only there were a human element. The snares of communicative capitalism persist in and deploy human intensities, all the way to the inhuman dimension of the drives. As Zizek writes, we become human when we get caught into a closed, self-propelling loop of repeating the same gesture and finding satisfaction in it. People enjoy the circulation of affect that presents itself as contemporary communication. The system is intense, it draws us in. Even when we think we aren't enjoying, we enjoy. All this email, I'm so busy, so important, my time is too precious to waste on another Facebook game, but my score is going up, it's such a burden having so many friends. Oh, and I should tweet about it so they know how busy I am. Blogs, social networks, Twitter, YouTube, they produce and circulate affect as a binding technique. Affect, or jouissance in Lacanian terms, is what accrues from reflexive communication, from communication for its own sake, from the endless circular movement of commenting, adding notes and links, bringing in new friends and followers, layering and interconnecting myriad communications platforms and devices. Every little tweet or comment, every forwarded image or petition, accrues a tiny affective nugget, a little surplus enjoyment, a smidgen of attention that attaches to it, making it stand out from the larger flow before it blends back in. We might find ourselves more fearful or seem somehow secure, even if we have no idea what we're looking for or what we've found. Unable to find a given dot, we feel, in ways that exceed our conscious perception, the movement of multiple colliding dots. These affective links are stronger than hypertextual ones. Their resonance remains and continues after specific links are no longer operative. In flame wars, spam, and critical linking not as a sign of affiliation but as evidence of something awful, outrageous, to be combated, intense feeling accompanies and reinforces code. Even failures to forward and refusals to link have affective impact. Why didn't she friend me? Why didn't he put me on his blog reel? In a world of code, gaps and omissions can become knots of anxiety. Affective attachments to media are not in themselves sufficient to produce actual communities. Bloggers are blogging, but the blogosphere doesn't exist. Neither does the circulation of affect through multiple, networked media imply stimulus junkies in blank-eyed isolation before their screens. Affective networks produce feelings of community, or what we might call community without community. They enable mediated relationships that take a variety of changing, uncertain, and interconnected forms as they feed back each upon the other in ways we can never fully account for or predict. So while relations in affective networks merge and diverge in ways resistant to formalization, the circulation of intensities leaves traces we might mark and follow: blog anxiety, mood flows on Twitter, military message intensification, irrational exuberance. Section 3. 2009 was the year of Twitter. Even before the so-called Twitter revolution in Iran, so-called because U.S. preoccupation with tweets occluded the more mundane organizing done with paper and pencil, Twitter's 140-character updates were widely heralded as the next phase of social media, for better or worse. With Twitter, one can send and receive messages to one's network, followers, from either laptop or phone, thereby staying in touch with a group while away from the computer. Twittering, like updates on Facebook, lets users keep connected without having to trouble with sending or responding to individual text messages. Users don't even need to concern themselves with specific followers. They can find and follow updates by topic, a practice enabled by hashtags, or phrases preceded by the hash sign, the number or pound sign. Rather than keeping abreast of what Joe is doing, for example, I can track tweets on specific issues. By 2009, politicians and celebrities seem to be tweeting their every move. Some U.S. members of Congress tweeted during President Barack Obama's first State of the Union address. Their tweets were archived and circulated, perpetual reminders of the inanity of these momentary updates. Large websites and blogs began to feature Twitter rooms, pages of twittered posts grouped thematically by poster, journalist, celebrity, right-wing political operative. Non-politicians and non-celebrities also tweeted. Even when our tweets weren't followed by more than a couple of hundred people, it still felt like something to issue updates and statements. Not surprisingly, commentary was mixed. For Alexander Zajic, Twitter feeds a growing constant contact media addiction, bird-like attention span compression, and vapidity to the point of depravity. What happens when the communication standard is 140 characters? What comes next? 70 characters? 20? The disappearance of words altogether, replaced by smiley face and cranky crab emoticons? Wired's Clive Thompson is more enthusiastic, in a bright side of crack sort of way. An early adopter, Thompson was already celebrating the stupefyingly trivial aspect of Twitter in the summer of 2007. For him, multiple, mindless updates result in something more, a kind of ambient awareness or social proprioception. They have a cumulative effect, producing a sense of others' everyday lives and feelings. Lauren Berlant describes Facebook's news feed. Quotation by Berlant. Facebook is about calibrating the difficulty of knowing the importance of the ordinary event. People are trying there to eventalize the mood, the inclination, the thing that just happened, the episodic nature of existence. So-and-so is in a mood right now. So-and-so likes this kind of thing right now, and just went here and there. This is how they felt about it. It's not in the idiom of the great encounter or the great passion, it's the lightness and play of the poke. End of quotation by Berlant. Like a tweet, a Facebook update marks the mundane by expressing it, by breaking it out of one flow of experience and introducing it into another. Now part of a shifting screen of comments and images, the mundane moment tags a mood or sensibility. Differently put, because updates are aspects of a practice, singular moments among many such moments, they both contribute to an effective flow and mark divergences from it. Little moment-to-moment reports suggest the pattern of changes in one's feelings about one's life, what is worth noting and why. The flow is the result of these multiple offerings, back and forth, up and down, on and on. The feel of the updates arises out of their setting, a setting that is a little different for everyone, not all your friends are mine. The fact of uttering, of adding in, displaces the content of any one utterance. The flow of tweets transmits what exceeds any specific tweet, that is, a broader, less tangible, more general mood. One even gets accustomed to overlooking tweets in their singularity, enjoying instead getting swept into their flow. By the summer of 2009, a study of 11.5 million Twitter accounts showed that the ambient awareness of Twitter was heavily tilted toward a small number of super users and a bunch of automated zombies. Just 5% of the accounts were generating 75% of the tweets, another example of power laws on the web. The authors of the report refer to Twitter's hockey stick-like growth. Likewise, while about 1% of users tweeted 10 or more times a day, over 85% tweeted less than once a day, and half hadn't updated in over a week, a finding hardly suggestive of an environment where one starts to sense the rhythms and feelings of the lives of others, unless, of course, the others in one's environment are marketers, advertisers, and automated bots. We were sensing not just networked-generated moods, not just the multiplication of the feedback effects of our tweets, but the directed channeling and amplification of some streams over and against others. The Sosomos study found that 24% of the tweets were coming from automated bots, feeds from elsewhere on the net, like Second Life, 2,000 plus updates per day from this virtual world, or Dogbook, Facebook for dogs. It also determined that social media marketers are far more active than overall users. Perhaps #Twitter tags the reflexivity of contemporary media networks as they turn back upon themselves. Section 4. One of the numerous scandals extending out of and around George W. Bush's aggressive war against Iraq involved the Pentagon's organization of former generals as media talking heads. Not only did these military analysts advocate war, parroting administration talking points, but many were also tied to the defense industry as executives, consultants, and board members. According to the New York Times, internal Pentagon documents repeatedly refer to the military analysts as message force multipliers or surrogates who could be counted on to deliver administration themes and messages to millions of Americans in the form of their own opinions. The term message force multipliers suggests one of the ways that state political power operates under communicative capitalism. I say suggests because the term message force multipliers can be accented in at least two ways: the force multiplication of messages or the multiplication of message forces. Force multiplication indexes a communications strategy for a complex media environment. It implies adding lots of forces, putting more people on the ground or on the air, just as one would send more troops into a situation. It's like spam for television, which is not the same as propaganda. The term propaganda isn't useful in an age of constant media, ever-present advertising, unavoidable spin. The government's provision of forces differs from spam on the internet, though, because it's spam by request. Television news shows invite the military analysts to appear and analyze what's going on. In this way, the mainstream, commercial media, including large right-wing blogs, ask to be bearers of the administration's media. They set themselves up to be its tools, its voice. When they aren't, they lose what they understand as access to power, to the story. News, then, is what the administration reports, and the mainstream media are the neutral vehicle, medium, for it, as if they had no responsibility for the practice formerly known as journalism. In psychoanalytic terms, this instrumental relation is perverse. Media position themselves as the means for others' enjoyment, whether that enjoyment is the administration's or, more likely, their sponsors. Multiplication of message forces indicates a concrete awareness of the affective dimension of media in communicative capitalism. The Bush administration excelled in accepting itself from the signifying aspect of language and relying instead on affective prompts. It absorbed the lesson from advertising and pop music: repetition exerts a force, a compulsion. Repetition has effects independent of the meaning of what is repeated. Repetition itself has an affective impact, a sexualizing pulsation, a threatening intrusion, a hilarious extreme. State politics in the 21st century in the US, UK, and Europe has become ever more adept at tying together previously stable meanings in ways that rely on and at the same time disrupt these meanings. This combination of reliance and disruption generates effective responses from the tension accompanying the combustion of meaning and non-meaning. The combination also suggests a tactical appreciation for contemporary short attention spans. With multiple message forces, one can keep a message alive on one terrain even as it dwindles in another, a role at which blogs excel. Issues that seem to have died can reanimate, mainstream journalists report, bloggers are debating, or as was recently uncovered by BlogX, the idea of multiplying message forces highlights how messages carry affective charges. The communication strategy on which it is based doesn't turn on getting our message out there, as if there were to be a debate on positions that need to be understood and considered. Rather, the goal is spreading, diversifying, and intensifying the message force. Abundant, dispersed, mashed-up messages thus displace previous communication strategies focused on direct image control. Even when facts are corrected, fictions remain, repeated and circulated in affective networks. The generals were vehicles for this spreading and distributing, message force genebots. My account here shares elements of Tiziana Terranova's description of informational culture. She writes, an informational culture marks the point where meaningful experiences are under siege, continuously undermined by a proliferation of signs that have no reference, only statistical patterns of frequency, redundancy and resonance, the obsessive frequency and redundancy of an advertising campaign, the mutually reinforcing resonance of self-help manuals and expert advice, the incessant bombardment of signifying influences. Such a media environment could be read in information theory's oppositional categories of signal and noise. This reading would indicate that the way to get one's message across would be to eliminate noise and establish a clear channel of communication, perhaps by going over the heads of the media and speaking directly to the people. Terranova rightly eschews the binary of signal and noise, arguing instead for the turbulent materiality of communication wherein information as such relies on distracted perception. For example, architecture and design induce bodily habits directly implicated in the processing of information. Signal and noise, then, not only exert reciprocal effects on each other but contribute to feedback processes in the environments out of and through which they are generated, transmitted, and received. Terranova's discussion is persuasive and surely right. Information is more than the delivery of a coded signal. Yet I jump to the active, material, dimensions of information relies on two omissions. The first is the split within a message between its content and the fact of its being sent, what I call its contribution, and what Lacanian psychoanalysis treats in terms of the enunciated and the enunciation. The recipient of a message can ask, "What does this mean?" attending thereby to a message's content. She can also ask, "Why are you sending me this?" drawing out the deliverer's purpose or intent, what the deliverer aims to contribute by sending the message. Terranova, explicating key debates in information theory, omits this doubling of the utterance into content and contribution, noting that communication at its most minimal depends on the establishment of a clear channel. For information theorists such as Claude E. Shannon, it simply doesn't matter who is sending and receiving. Terranova's omission, while responsive to information theory, occludes a key feature of networked communication, the displacement of content by contribution, more specifically, by communication for its own sake. Contemporary affective networks rely on the marking, adding, forwarding, and circulating of messages not because doing so means something but simply to communicate. As with Cicero's causerie, described in Chapter 2, contemporary communication is whatever communication, the communication of communicativity. Tweets, Facebook updates, images of cute kitties, text messages, these media of affective flow can be limited neither to their content nor to their materiality. Understanding them requires attending to their doubling as message and contribution and grappling with the ways that the latter's displacement of the former amplifies the chaotic, intensive, circulation of enjoyment even as it diminishes the impact of any single contribution. The second omission effected by Terra Nova's jump to a materiality rendered as chairs and keyboards, bottles and telephones is its neglect of the materiality already at play and perceiving. Perception as such is distracted, contorted around a stain or gap. As I discuss in Chapter 2, one of the ways Lacanian psychoanalysis theorizes this gap is in terms of the gaze. This concept designates the way that one's perceptions are always partial and incomplete. As we fill them in, we infuse our perceptions with inadequacies and distortions. For example, the subject might fill in what he wants to see, his desire may fill in the gaps he encounters. He may then become aware of such a gap, and his involvement in it, turning his attention from the object of perception to himself as perceiver. The point is that perceiving requires attending to some aspects of a setting rather than others, even as that attending may be involuntary, compelled by an element in a situation, unconscious, or a deliberate effort at focusing one's attention on one's breath rather than on the multiple stresses of one's day. As a tactic in the Bush administration's communications strategy, message force multipliers presuppose both the displacement of content by contributions and distracted perception. They thrive, in other words, not in a closed media environment but in the open, distributed, recombinant, chaotic feedback loops of affective networks. In contrast to a state politics waged through message force multipliers, Terra Nova claims that opinion polls, surveys, and risk assessments are the most effective and concise modality of information transmission today. Her response is to advocate a cultural politics of information. One component of a cultural politics of information would posit radically other codes and channels. Although the very notion of radically other makes it impossible to imagine or assess such codes and channels, if they could be imagined or assessed, they wouldn't be radically other but would be in some relation to our current setting. Likewise, insofar as they are radically other, their political implications are unknowable. Terra Nova's suggestion could be valuable. Yet her analysis is premised on a too-quick mapping of information theory onto information politics. Under communicative capitalism, an excess of polls, surveys, and assessments circulates, undercutting not only the efficacy of any particular poll or survey but the conditions of possibility for knowledge and credibility as such. There is always another survey, done by another group or association with whatever bias and whatever methodology, displacing whatever information one thought one had. Another component of Terra Nova's cultural politics of information would pursue digitalizing tendencies to decompose and recombine, tendencies she associates with montage, via the work of Pierre Levy. Given Lacan's association of montage with the drive and the repetitive jumping among heterogeneous elements, decomposition and recombination appear more as aspects of our capture in affective networks than as tactics of resistance. Differently put, drive as montage indicates how media tactics of resistance such as mashups and remixes are already captured. Not only do they contribute to the ever-circulating flow, amplifying the intensity of the very elements they seek critically to recombine, but in presuming the efficacy of a politics of meaning they displace attention from the fact that the multiple elements of our contemporary media ecology are already fragments and parts ready for recombination. The politics that montage suggests is a politics released from burdens of coherence and consistency. It needs neither theme nor message but can employ questions and repetitions. It is not a politics that relies on the intensity of the image and the afterlife that such intensities carry but one that has already challenged and undercut, remastered, recontextualized, and mashed up innumerable uploaded and recirculated images. Understood in terms of drive, montage clicks on a politics that exceeds the constraints of narrative, appearing as a combination of disparate images shifting and mutating without beginning or end, head or tail. In the setting of communicative capitalism, we might also think of such a politics in terms of links and windows, text messages and blog posts, contributions to the flows into which any addition is absorbed. What's clear is that far from a left-wing political application, montage is well suited to a political right, in both its neoliberal and its neoconservative guise, insofar as this right thrives on uncertainty, insecurity, and turbulence as easing the flow of affective intensities and consolidating our capture in the networks of drive. Section 5. More than a decade before his famous recantation of the ideology that had guided his life, and brought global financial markets to their knees, Alan Greenspan, then chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve Board, gave a speech at the American Enterprise Institute where he was being honored with a prestigious award. Entitled The Challenge of Central Banking in a Democratic Society, the speech outlined the history of the Federal Reserve, particularly with regard to maintaining the purchasing power of money. Greenspan pointed out the difficulties with inflation and unemployment in the 1970s, crediting a turn away from Keynesianism and toward monetarism as key to remedying those economic problems. Yet he also confronted an emerging non-knowledge or loss in knowledge at the level of the economy. Greenspan noted the complexity of pinning down the notion of what constitutes a stable general price level. If prices are necessary for measuring inflation, which prices matter? Do escalating stock and real estate prices pose a problem to economic stability? What about the price of a unit of software or a legal opinion? The combination of informatization and the post-industrial shift toward the service sector's increased role in the economy eluded the standard mechanisms for assessing changes in prices and hence inflation. Technology figures heavily in Greenspan's speech. The chairman mentioned costly equipment expenditures associated with increasing the safety and reliability of electronic payments. Like a breakdown in an electric power grid, small mishaps create large problems. As if foreshadowing the economic debacle that would cascade from the collapse of the investment banking firm Lehman Brothers 12 years later, Greenspan observed as well the risks associated with financial interconnectivity. The failure of a single institution will ricochet around the world, shutting down much of the world's payments system. Most of the press on his speech, though, highlighted his gesture to the booming stock market. The Dow Jones Industrial Average had risen nearly 3,000 points over the preceding 2 years, a rise seemingly driven by Internet stocks, despite the fact that no information technologies were yet included in the Dow. How do we know when irrational exuberance has unduly escalated asset values? The dot-com bubble didn't burst for 4 more years. It intensified and expanded. Not only did the Dow rise another 5,000 points, but stocks, markets, and investing infused U.S. popular culture, becoming intense attractors of interest and attention. For some, including Greenspan, the key factor behind the market boom was the fact that the country had entered into a new era. Technology and competition created new opportunities for prosperity and growth, indeed, whole new ways of conceptualizing prosperity and growth. For others, that increases in corporate earnings in the mid-90s coincided with popular uptake of the Internet. The Mosaic browser was released in 1994, the Internet backbone was fully pushed into the private sector by 1995, did not mean that computers and the Internet themselves caused the increases. Most of the Internet companies, despite their extraordinarily successful initial public stock offerings, were not themselves making a profit. Still, the Internet felt profitable. It felt new, exciting, innovative. Greenspan emphasized awesome changes. Net cheerleaders like Wired editor Kevin Kelly celebrated the expansion in opportunities ushered in by the net, an expansion so significant that firms could stop thinking in traditional economic terms like productivity and problem solving. More important were conversations, relationships, networks, all of which amplified value, even if this value couldn't be quantified or monetized. Kelly thus emphasized ever-extending feedback loops. Each actualization of an idea supplies room for more technology, and each new technology supplies room for more ideas. They feed on each other, rounding faster and faster. Critics, also identifying the Internet with feedback loops, saw the booming stock market not as proof of a new economic era but of a speculative bubble with its own self-fulfilling momentum. Where Kelly perceived opportunity cascades, economist Robert Shiller saw information cascades, that is, people, investors, taking a kind of information shortcut by assuming that what everyone else is doing must be right. For example, if we believe our friends are on Facebook, we will join. Even if our friends aren't there yet, after we've joined, they will, too. During the dot-com bubble of the 90s, Herd behavior, copying the actions of others, started to make sense. In fact, not doing so when all these others seemed to be becoming millionaires felt irrational, like being left behind, a dupe and a sucker. Applying George Soros's theory of reflexivity in financial markets, described in Chapter 1, John Cassidy argues that the reflexive process of the 90s bubble was most powerful in the technology sector. The same technology on which people were speculating was enabling ever more speculation. America Online, CompuServe and E-Trade allowed independent investors to trade online. By 1999, over 5 million U.S. households had online trading accounts. Likewise, computer-linked day traders, there were over 60 day trading firms in 1999, quickly bought and sold stocks as they tried to profit from small shifts in price. Both groups relied not only on networked trading but also on the ever-increasing deluge of financial information, cable news, financial chat rooms, close to real-time share prices. Exchanges of tips and opinions amplified both the popular feeling that money was being made and the individual sense that one had the information necessary to join right in. Using internet technologies to make money seemed to prove that the technologies themselves were money makers without limit, even when, especially when, the actual companies showed no profits and quickly burnt through their venture capital. Some of the more spectacular collapses included Pets.com, which lost over $100 million, and eToys, with debts over $270 million. The rapid, expanding, intensifying circulation of information and capital traced a loop around a change in knowledge. Not only did the speculative bubble indicate that markets could be irrational, that prices could well be the outcome of irrational exuberance, and that people would speculate on the fact that predicting exactly when the bubble would burst was impossible, but the information superhighway didn't seem to provide much information. The issue is not the typical lament regarding search engines and filters. It's the fact of fundamental non-knowledge and uncertainty. Even Wired editor and network propagandist Kevin Kelly acknowledges this point as he urges his readers to jump, act, risk, move. Anything can be an opportunity. One doesn't know what will work, what will fail. Tucked at the very end of his new rules for the new economy is Kelly's version of the decline of symbolic efficiency. Quotation by Kelly. Because the nature of the network economy seeds disequilibrium, fragmentation, uncertainty, churn, and relativism, the anchors of meaning and value are in short supply. We are simply unable to deal with questions that cannot be answered by means of technology. End of quotation by Kelly. A decade after the dot-com bust, the so-called advanced economies confronted the even more extreme and devastating collapse of the credit, mortgage, and finance markets, again in the wake of a massive bubble of irrational exuberance. Investors have convinced themselves that they had the mathematical formulae and computing skills necessary to shield themselves from risk, neglecting the fact that when enough people subscribe to a particular means of taming financial risks, then that itself brings new risk. Barely 3 months before the collapse of Lehman Brothers ushered in a once-in-a-century financial and economic calamity, another Wired editor embraced and exaggerated Kelly's point about our inability to deal with questions that can't be answered through technology. Chris Anderson pronounced that such questions need not even be asked. The data deluge makes science and theory obsolete. This is a world where massive amounts of data and applied mathematics replace every other tool that might be brought to bear. Out with every theory of human behavior, from linguistics to sociology. Forget taxonomy, ontology, and psychology. Neglecting the ways human behavior leads not just to bubbles but to the rational irrationality of short-term investments precisely because everyone else is doing it contributes mightily to extreme fluctuations in financial markets, at great human cost. Estimates of the loss of wealth in the 2008-09 crisis exceed $10 trillion. Anderson similarly ignores how interpretations of data both shape data and are themselves also data. Differently put, he omits the fact that interpretations of behavior influence behavior. This neglect of feedback is particularly shocking coming from an editor of Wired. Section 6. In his comments on the Society of the Spectacle, published 20 years after the Society of the Spectacle, Guy Debord offers the notion of the integrated spectacle as the highest stage of the spectacular society. Although he doesn't describe the integrated spectacle as a reflexive circuit or as the spectacle's turning in upon itself, such reflexivity seems to be its primary conceptual innovation. De Boer writes, "For the final sense of the integrated spectacle is this, that it has integrated itself into reality to the same extent as it was describing it, and that it was reconstructing it as it was describing it. As a result, this reality no longer confronts the integrated spectacle as something alien. The integrated spectacle is an element of the world it depicts, it is part of the scene upon which it looks. It is a circuit." De Boer misses the circuitry of the integrated spectacle because his account of the spectacle is embedded in a model of broadcast media. His arguments thus proceed as if the problem of the spectacle remained, for all its dispersion, ultimately a matter of top-down control, of actors and spectators. De Boer worries about images as the individual's principal connection to the world. The problem, though, isn't with the image's displacement of language and critical thought or even with its commodity function. Rather, De Boer's worry stems from the fact that the images the spectator sees are chosen and constructed by someone else. When chosen by someone else is the problem, the solution seems like it can be found in choosing and constructing for oneself, and maybe with cool free software, or with photo and video uploading and sharing capabilities, freedom through Apple and Flickr. If the problem of the image is that it comes from someone else, then participatory technology is the solution. Anyone who makes her own images is a threat, a radical, a revolutionary. But this solution leaves out underlying questions of access and ownership, not to mention the fundamental trap of an ever-intensifying image environment as more and more of us upload videos to YouTube. De Boer suggests that in the spectacular society, those who control information can alter at will individual reputations. He doesn't consider what changes when we alter our images ourselves. "I should have never posted those party pics on Facebook." He can't allow, in other words, for the possibility that in choosing for ourselves, in participating in the production of the spectacle, we might contribute to our own capture. Discussion poses a problem similar to the manipulated image. De Boer claims that spectacular discourse leaves no room for any reply. This doesn't apply to contemporary networked information and entertainment media. It's easy to reply all, although these replies, like the others circulating around and through us, don't feel like responses, they are just more contributions to be deleted, stored, or forwarded. De Boer writes that people have never been less entitled to make their opinions heard. Again, under communicative capitalism, the opposite is the case. Everyone not only has a right to express an opinion, but each is positively enjoined to vote, text, comment, share, blog. Constant communication is an obligation. Every interaction, transaction, inaction, reaction is construed in terms of a conversation. De Boer rightly emphasizes the repetition constitutive of the spectacle. Arguments in the spectacle prove themselves by going round in circles, by coming back to the start. Yet he laments that there is no place left where people can discuss the realities which concern them. Today people discuss the realities that concern them everywhere and all the time. Blogs, Facebook, Twitter, they ooze with the realities of individual concern. Talk. Discussion, far from displaced, has itself become a barrier against acts as action is perpetually postponed. What appears as an exchange of reasons is a vehicle for the circulation of effects. The lack of action is the abundance of discussion viewed from a different angle. De Boer criticizes the experts who serve the media and state, experts he presents as falsifiers and fools. His argument, again reinforcing an underlying assumption that participatory media technologies might prove a way out of spectacular society, relies on a faith in amateurs, in ordinary people, individuals with the capacity to see things for themselves. Insofar as De Boer's critique positions professionals as completely bound to the spectacular state, it relies on a suspicion toward expertise. Not only can expert knowledge not be trusted, but there is really no such thing as expertise. The ability to falsify is unlimited. Failing to follow his argument to the end, De Boer implies that non-expert knowledge necessarily brings with it capacities for resistance and transgression. This may be true under mass media, particularly in the case of censorious mass media. In the setting of communicative capitalism, another name for the impossibility of expertise, for falsification without limit, is the decline of symbolic efficiency. How do we know whom to believe or trust? Suspicion or even uncertainty toward expertise goes all the way down. Skepticism toward politicians and the media, scientists and academics, extends to local knowledges, knowledges rooted in experience, and anything at all appearing on the internet. Not only has amateurism and gut-level or street knowledge supplanted what was previously considered expertise, but even amateur and everyday knowledge is now rejected as nothing more than opinion, and opinion which is necessarily limited, biased, and countered by others. The ability to falsify is unlimited. The lack of a capacity to know is the other side of the abundance of knowledge. Finally, correlative to the embeddedness of Debord's critique of the image, discussion, and expertise in mass media is his presumption that the spectacle is a form of state power, that it is a vehicle for mastery over the people. Understood reflexively, constant, pervasive communication can be a regime of control in which the people willingly and happily report on their views and activities and stalk their friends. Networked whatever beings don't need spectacles staged by politicians and the mass media. We can make and be our own spectacles, and this is much more entertaining. There is always something new on the internet. Corporate and state power need not go to the expense and trouble to keep people entertained, passive, and diverted. We prefer to do that ourselves. Mark Andrevick's analysis of the constellation of voyeurism and self-disclosure in interactive media, his focus is on the reality television message boards. Television without pity, persuasively demonstrates the ways even dismissive, critical engagement with television binds viewers more closely to the shows they claim to hate. The result, he argues, is a reflexive redoubling that amounts to an active form of self-submission. Networked, participatory spectacles let us stage and perform our own entrapment. Debord provides a helpful list of the features of society at the stage of the integrated spectacle. Quotation by Debord. 1. Incessant technological renewal, which surrenders everyone to the mercy of specialists. 2. Integration of state and economy. 3. Generalized secrecy. 4. Unanswerable lies have eliminated public opinion which has lost the ability to make itself heard. 5. An eternal present. End of quotation by Debord. I offer the following alterations as a way of upgrading Debord for communicative capitalism. 1. Incessant technological renewal, which contributes to the production of amateurs and a sense that no specialist ever really knows. 2. Neoliberalization of governance, the state uses its power to maintain inequality, supporting the privilege of financial elites. Debord's account remains bound to a critique of technocracy and the welfare state. 3. Generalized publicity, revelation and disconcealment. For example, the U.S. government can admit to torture and face no significant repercussions. 4. A decreasing ability to distinguish between truth and lies, a decline of a politics where truth matters, collapse of symbolic efficiency. 5. A focus on what's next, prediction, forecasting, the biggest thing after the next biggest thing. Debord's claim that, in the society of the spectacle, the uses of media guarantee a kind of eternity of noisy insignificance applies better to communicative capitalism as a disintegrated, networked, spectacular circuit. Key to this circulation is the fact that networks are not only networks of computers, protocological and fiber optic networks. They are also affective networks capturing people. If we revisit the discussion of Agamben from the preceding chapter, we recall that the spectacle returns us to our linguistic nature in an inverted fashion. The spectacle contains and captures the possibility of a common good. We could even say its production of a common is its good, or that the power of spectacle is its production of the common as a feeling, necessarily shared. Its form is inseparable from its affect. A spectacle is affective form and this is its common good. Section 7. Critical media theorists have recently begun to consider the affective dimension of networks. Describing the shift in thought toward affect, Patricia Clough writes that the affective turn marks an intensification of self-reflexivity, processes turning back on themselves to act on themselves, in information/communications systems, including the human body, in archiving machines, including all forms of media technologies and human memory, in capital flows, including the circulation of value through human labor and technology, and in biopolitical networks of disciplining, surveillance, and control. Some of the recent work on affect and media technologies extends out of Michael Hart's and Antonio Negri's empire, which is influenced by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. In the context of outlining empire as a new global political economic formation, Hart and Negri discuss the expansion and proliferation of communication networks as well as the role of informatization in the post-Fordist economy. Among the changes in labor they associate with informatization is the production and manipulation of affect. Here they are concerned with feelings of attachment, affection, excitement, fear, ease, or well-being as products. Hart and Negri view affective labor as including such seemingly diverse sectors as entertainment, healthcare, and women's unpaid labor. Each of these areas involves the production of feelings, be they those of thrill and amusement, vitality and security, or care and belonging. Women's affective labor is particularly important to Hart and Negri's account because it produces social networks. They don't link these social networks directly to the internet, however, nor do they take up the disruptive dimensions of networked intensities. Nonetheless, their association of affective labor with the production of social networks opens up the possibility of conceiving communication networks not simply in terms of linked machines but as networks that are constitutively affective. Alexander Galloway and Eugene Thacker go further in this direction as they critique Hart and Negri for relying on a simple symmetry between empire and the revolutionary force opposing it, the multitude. For Galloway and Thacker, the network form itself needs to be interrogated, particularly with regard to the constitutive tension between unitary aggregation and anonymous distribution, between the intentionality and agency of individuals and groups on the one hand, and the uncanny, unhuman intentionality of the network as an abstract whole. My claim is that this uncanny intentionality is best understood via the psychoanalytic notion of drive. The loops and repetitions of the acephalous circuit of drive describe the movement of the networks of communicative capitalism, the ways its flows capture subjects, intensities, and aspirations. Accompanying each repetition, each loop or reversal, is a little nugget of enjoyment. We contribute to the networks as creative producers and vulnerable consumers because we enjoy it. In fact, the open architecture of the Internet enables and requires the capture of enjoyment insofar as it is premised on users' contributions, alterations, and engagement. It's not like cinema, where people only have to show up. For the Internet to function at all, as is abundantly clear in Web 2.0 and 3G mobile networks, people have to use it, add to it, extend it, play with it. Our participation does not subvert communicative capitalism. It drives it. Again, contemporary information and communication networks are essentially affective networks. Terranova also jumps off from Hart and Negri's discussion of empire in terms of a network of networks. Particularly compelling in this regard is her rejection of all too static accounts of the Internet as a global grid or extended database that displace attention from movement in and through the networks. Communication networks are dynamic. Terranova writes, a piece of information spreading throughout the open space of the network is not only a vector in search of a target, it is also a potential transformation of the space cross that always leaves something behind, a new idea, a new effect, even an annoyance, a modification of the overall topology. This something left behind, this product of movement through the networks, should be thought in terms of enjoyment. Both result from circulation through a communicative space. Terranova approaches this affective production, however, via the image. She positions the image as a sort of bioweapon in an informational ecology. Although the image is too restrictive a notion to account for the variety of contributions to contemporary networks, music, sounds, words, sentences, games, videos, fragments of code, viruses, bots, crawlers, and the flow of interactions themselves as in blogs, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, Terranova rightly highlights that what's at stake in the image is the kind of affect that it packs, the movements that it receives, inhibits, and/or transmits. The most interesting aspect of the image, in other words, is the way that it is not simply itself but itself plus a nugget or shadow or trace of intensity. An image is itself and more. Psychoanalysis can be of some assistance in theorizing the movement's terra nova associates with affect. As Joan Kopiak points out, both Freud and Lacan associate affect with movement. Freud viewed affect as a kind of displacement, representation's fundamental out-of-phaseness with itself. The conventional view of the displacement of affect treats it as the distortion of perception by an excess of feeling. Kopiak disagrees, arguing that the affective experience of something as moving index is a movement beyond the perceiving individual, a surfeit or excess that ruptures the perception, making it more than itself and enabling it to open up another register, for Lacan, the real, for Deleuze, the virtual. Affect, then, is this movement, a movement which estranges the subject from its experience. A thought, memory, or perception is affective to the extent that it opens up or indexes something beyond me. I can't help but think of the cute cat photos and funny animal videos that circulate on the net. Why do people upload, forward, and link to these? It's not only because cats are cute or even because one's own cat is completely interesting. It's that the feeling that the cuteness accesses, the feeling that moves it, opens to something more, to a kind of beyond or potential. The dimension of affect is this more than a feeling that imparts movement. The potential here may be for connection, though one should be careful not to reduce affect to the intentions of the subject sending cute cat photos, but not necessarily. Anyone who uses email knows how annoying forwarded cuteness can actually be. Cute sayings or images are also not the only contributions that circulate. Funny videos, shocking statements, pressing opportunities, silly applications all inhabit contemporary communication networks. They all provide momentary, even fleeting, charges and intensities, interruptions and divergences. Insofar as affect as a movement designates a doubling of an image, utterance, perception, or sound into itself and something else, we can account for the affective discharge of reflexivized communication. The additive dimension of communication for its own sake designates an excess. This excess isn't a new meaning or perspective. It doesn't refer to a new content. It is rather the intensity accrued from the repetition, the excitement or thrill of more. In the reflexive doubling of communication, the enjoyment attached to communication for its own sake displaces intention, content, and meaning. The something extra in repetition is enjoyment, the enjoyment that is captured in the drive and the enjoyment that communicative capitalism expropriates. At the same time that affect is movement, there is a specific effect that is a halting or arrest. Kopiak invokes the image of running in place. This effect that is an inhibition of movement is anxiety. The experience of anxiety is a confrontation with excessive enjoyment. One encounters what is in one more than oneself, an alien yet intimate kernel at the core of one's being. Kopiak writes, "Jouissance makes me me, while preventing me from knowing who I am." Finding oneself face to face with jouissance, one is pulled between incomprehensibility and extreme intimacy. Kopiak identifies two versions of the experience of anxiety: exposure to the excess of our unrealized past and to the punishing, relentless superego, itself an altered form of jouissance. As Zizek frequently puts it, the fundamental injunction of the superego is enjoy. In the first instance, my anxiety results from encountering past alternatives. What would I have become had I stayed in that relationship? What would have happened had I arrived the next day instead? Kopiak writes, in the experience of anxiety, one has a sense not only of being chained to an enjoyment that outstrips and precedes one, but also of the opacity of this enjoyment, its incomprehensibility and unassumability, which is dependent, I have argued, on its being grounded in nothing actual, in a thrust-aside past that never took place. Facing my enjoyment, uniquely mine but alien and seemingly unchosen, I cannot avoid the unsettling question: how did I get here? We should also add to this aspect of anxiety the enjoyment of the other. As Zizek explains, one of the ways that the subject organizes enjoyment is via fantasies about the other. These fantasies express essential features of our own enjoyment. For example, homophobic treatments of gay men as excessively promiscuous, as having frequent, intense, anonymous sexual encounters, express the homophobe's suppositions regarding real sexual satisfaction. Consequently, for conservatives, gay marriage threatens marriage itself by eliminating its supplemental fantasy, that one sacrificed real sexual satisfaction for its sake. This sacrifice is necessary for the sacred character of marriage. Without it, sex becomes common, conventional, and rather boring. In other words, the worst that the homophobe can imagine is that gay sex is just as boring as married sex. Quotation by Zizek. The fascinating image of the other gives a body to our own innermost split, to what is in us more than ourselves, and thus prevents us from achieving full identity with ourselves. The hatred of the other is the hatred of our own excessive enjoyment. End of quotation by Zizek. In the second instance, the experience of anxiety results from the superego injunction to enjoy. The superego commands the subject to an impossible enjoyment, to find complete fulfillment in sex, exercise, professional achievement, a fabulous vacation. The very impossibility of fulfilling this injunction not only suffocates the poor subject but also incites a flight away from anxiety and toward the pursuit of knowledge. To avoid the anxiety of the jouissance that prevents me from knowing who I am, I come under a compulsion to keep on knowing more and more, a compulsion or thrust that Lacan associates with an epistemological drive. The attempt to escape anxiety thus results in capture at another level. Lacan associates this capture with science, capitalism, and the discourse of the university. We can extend this point by noting their contemporary merger and materialization in networked information and communications media. After all, the Internet arose in the context of government-sponsored research, initially carried out not only at the Department of Defense but also at a small number of universities, the linking together of which provided the groundwork for the Internet that was later opened up to commercial interests and celebrated as the primary figure of global capitalism. To reiterate, the object of anxiety is surplus jouissance, designated by Lacan as objet petit. Kopyek presents it in terms of a confrontation with an unrealized past as well as with the superego, a confrontation the subject attempts to flee by pursuing knowledge. Her account of anxiety corresponds to what Zizek, following Jacques-Alain Millet, designates as constitutive anxiety, that is, confrontation with objet petit as constituted in its very loss, that is, objet petit as an object of drive. In both instances, the object is loss, rather than lost, the loss of an unknowable past, rather than a specific experience, the loss of a capacity to obey or comply. No matter what one does, one cannot satisfy the superego. The blockage or stuckness of anxiety, then, is at the same time the repetitive, circular movement of drive, the force of loss. The point becomes clearer when we consider epistemological drive, keep on knowing more and more. In Lacan's account in Seminar 17, this keeping on results from the change in the status of the master in university discourse, that is to say, a change in the status and function of knowledge. Because university discourse cannot be anchored, cannot be held in place by an ultimate truth or injunction, it keeps on keeping on knowing. It doesn't come to an end or reach an ultimate goal. It circulates, and its circulation is an effect of its failure to anchor. Nothing can stop the progress of science, nothing can stop the movement of ideas. Information wants to be free, to circulate round and round. The more knowledge we accrue, the less we know. Abundance from one perspective is lack from another. The networks of communicative capitalism are effective because they are characterized by drive. Their effective dimension thus should not be reduced to desiring productivity or a nurturing emotional practice. Contra Harton agree, networked communication is better understood via the negativity of drive, a negativity that results in stuckness and movement, rupture and creativity, a negativity, in other words, capable of accounting for the reflexivity in real networks. So, negativity here connotes positive feedback and the excess of an effect in relation to its cause. More crudely put, the affective charges we transmit and confront reinforce and extend affective networks without encouraging, and, indeed, by displacing, their consolidation into organized political networks. While this circulation might constitute a kind of affective labor, it is affective labor that is already captured. In fact, rather than presuming the fit of the category of labor, we do better to note the persistent disagreement among bloggers and net researchers regarding work and play in social networks. When we blog, are we working or playing? If we are working, then for whom are we working? Who enjoys or who accrues enjoyment? If we enjoy, does that mean we are actually playing? Or might the instability here index the fact that we are caught in circuits of drive wherein we cannot escape enjoyment but neither can we assume or accept it as our own? Lost horizon. Loss as horizon. the now-old cyberpunk fiction of a cyberspace, techno-utopian fantasy of an information frontier, and still lingering supposition of the internet as a domain separate from real life continued to dwindle as imaginaries of an outside. Global communications networks connect through a variety of devices, technologies, and media: internet, mobile phones, radio, television, global positioning systems, game platforms, etc. One of the more interesting features of massive multiplayer online role-playing games is the intersecting of game and non-game worlds. Players can buy and trade currencies and characters outside the game space. What initially appears as the most separate and complete realm for living fantasies quickly opens up into the actualities of financial markets, wage labor, and exploitation. The expansions and intensifications of networked interactions thus point not to a closed field but to the non-all real of human interaction. In his later work, Zizek supplements the Lacanian account of the real as that which always returns to its place as that which remains the same in all possible, symbolic, universes. He adds the notion of a parallax real, that is, a real capable of accounting for the multiplicity of appearances of the same underlying real. Such a parallax real is a gap or shift between perspectives. It does not embody a substantial point of information or sensory perception. You feel it in your gut, I feel it in my bones. Rather, it is the shift from one perspective to another. The real, then, does not refer to what is the same but to the hard burn of contention which pulverizes the sameness into the multitude of appearances. It is retroactively posited as the necessary yet impossible cause of this very multiplicity. In other words, the parallax real denotes multiplicity and its impossible core, a purely virtual, actually non-existent X. Such a notion of a parallax real is well suited to communicative capitalism. What appears is multiplicity, pulverization, the constant and repeated assertion of something else, something different. To the extent that the shifts of perspective appear immediately, without interpretation, meaning, elevation to the status of a universal, they obscure the fact of contention, as if the shifts were among a multitude of singularities each with its own perspective, none of which is more powerful, more structural, or more true than another. An example from the US is the way that conservatives accuse liberals of racism when liberals argue for racial diversity and political appointments. What is obscured is the underlying gap or disavowal, the virtual X of fundamental antagonism. The multiplicity of shifts effaces their embeddedness in capitalism, more specifically, the communicative capitalism that makes their expression possible. If the real is ultimately impossible, then it names the obstacle we come up against in our supposition and experience of reality. In communicative capitalism, that obstacle is the missing efficiency of the symbolic. The real of the internet is the circulatory movement of drive, the repeated making, uploading, sampling, and decomposition occurring as movement on the internet doubles itself, becoming itself and its record or trace, affected by symbolic efficiency as loss. The movement from link to link, the forwarding and storing and commenting, the contributing without expectation of response but in hope of further movement, why else count page views, is circulation for its own sake. Drive's circulation forms a loop. The empty space within it, then, is not the result of the loss of something that was there before and now is missing. The drive of the internet is not around the missing master signifier, which is foreclosed rather than missing. Instead, it is the inside of the loop, the space of nothing that the loop makes appear. This endless loop that persists for its own sake is the difference that makes a difference between so-called old and new media. Old media sought to deliver messages. New media just circulate. Understanding this circulation via drive enables us to grasp how we are captured in its loop, how the loop ensnares. First, we enjoy failure. Insofar as the aim of the drive is not to reach its goal but to enjoy, we enjoy our endless circulation, our repetitive loop. We cannot know certainly, we cannot know adequately. But we can mobilize this loss, Googling, checking Wikipedia, mistrusting it immediately, losing track of what we are doing, going somewhere else. We are captured because we enjoy. This idea appears in writing that associates new media with drugs, users and using, as well as colloquial expressions like face crack. As a friend said to me, well, why didn't you tell me Mafia Wars is like crack? Now I'll totally play. Thomas L. Esser illustrates the point via YouTube. Describing his movement among the links and videos, he writes. Quotation by Thomas L. Esser. After an hour or so, one realizes on what fine a line one has to balance to keep one's sanity, between the joy of discovering the unexpected, the marvelous and occasionally even the miraculous, and the rapid descent into an equally palpable anxiety, staring into the void of a sheer bottomless amount of videos, with their proliferation of images, their banality or obscenity in sounds and commentary. End of quotation by Thomas L. Zesser. Failure, or what L. Zesser tags constructive instability, is functional for communicative capitalism. It's our ensnarement in the loop of drive. Second, we are captured in our passivity or, more precisely, by the reversion of our active engagements and interventions into passive forms of being made aware or having been stated. The problem, then, is that ubiquitous, personal media, communication for its own sake, turn our activity into passivity. They capture it, use it. We end up oscillating between extremes. On the one hand, we have opinions, theories, ideas, and information that we want to share. So we write our books and blogs, adding in our contribution to the circulating flow. Just what was needed, another blog. On the other hand, the information age is an age wherein we lack the information we need to act. As communicative capitalism incites a continuous search for information, it renders information perpetually out of reach. Outraged, engaged, desperate to do something, we look for evidence, ask questions, and make demands, again contributing to the circuits of drive. A concrete example here is the George W. Bush administration's torture policy. Before and after Bush left office, a refrain circulated concerning the need to get to the truth of the situation, to see more photographs, to read more documents, as if it had not been known since at least 2004 that the US was torturing prisoners captured in the so-called War on Terror. Since photographs and documents already were circulating, since members of the Bush administration, including Vice President Cheney, had already acknowledged that they did in fact approve the policy of torture, the problem was not the absence of information. What was missing is instead more radical, namely, a capacity to see ourselves as acting rather than querying, searching, waiting for action to happen. Christian Marazzi makes a related observation in his description of imitative behavior among those working in the finance sector. He writes, "One important result of the empirical studies of the behavioral finance theorists is this very notion of imitative behavior based on the structural information deficits of all investors, be they large or small. The modalities of communication of what the others consider a good stock to invest in counts more than what is communicated." Psychoanalysis associates an imitative, competitive relation to others with imaginary identification. Imitative behavior can thus be read as an index of the decline of symbolic efficiency. Unable to find a standpoint from which to assess the adequacy of the available information, bond traders and hedge fund managers mimic those around them, creating cascades and bubbles. The gaze, discussed in Chapter 2, draws us to a third way we are captured in contemporary communication networks. Because the gaps are not filled, because perception as such is distorted, because they cannot be filled, we are drawn to them, inscribing ourselves in the images we see, the texts that we read. So although online interactions like blogging might initially appear as so many ways that we search for ourselves, trying to know who we are, to pull together our fragmented identities, the other aspect of the gaze, its dramatic disruption of the image, is perhaps even more crucial. Lacking answers, ever more uncertain, we become mesmerized by our own looking, entranced by the reversal of looking for an object to looking at ourselves as objects, to becoming objects ourselves. I can approach the same idea from a different direction. The satisfaction provided by identifying with a group also arises from transgressing the group's expectations. Scary zombie pop-ups spliced into conventional YouTube videos illustrate this point. Just as the viewer has become absorbed in the video, perhaps searching for the ghost or the key to the magic trick, a monstrous image accompanied by a hideous scream shocks her out of her absorption, reminding her that, in a way, the fault is hers. She shouldn't have been wasting her time watching videos online, shouldn't have let her guard down, shouldn't have presumed that the video images had a flow independent of her investment in them. Contemporary communication networks are reflexive. We, the users, are creating them. We are producing the environment we inhabit, the connections that configure us. We provide the feedback that amplifies or ignores, or write the code that provides the feedback that amplifies or ignores. We are configuring the worlds we inhabit, yet they are ever less what we desire but haven't reached, and ever more what we cannot escape yet still enjoy. I have argued throughout this book that the psychoanalytic concept of drive helps explain our current media trap, as it designates the plasticity of the objects to which we become attached, the repetitive movements of our attachment through networks, and the extremes and disequilibria inextricable from the circuits that result. Drive index is the primary structure of enjoyment for contemporary whatever beings. Affective networks capture users in circuits of drive. The more we contribute, the more extensive our submission. More bluntly put, as we share our opinions and upload our videos, there are more opinions to read and videos to watch, and then more responses to craft and elements to mash up. And then there are still more responses to read, and as these increase so do the challenges of finding the ones we want. At that point, we can see what the crowd thinks, what has passed muster, risen to the top, been shared, forwarded, and recommended. The result looks like a power law distribution. Like any hit movie, song, or best-selling novel, new voices are disadvantaged. Those without language, media, and visual skills will remain lost in the flow. With each click and intervention, moreover, we make a mark that can be traced, capitalized, and sold. This does not mean that systems of surveillance and expropriation are seamless and efficient. On the contrary, intensifications can disrupt, overload, and crash particular sites and servers. They can register as new trending topics on Twitter and in the blog archipelago, perhaps even getting a minute or two of airtime on cable news and maybe occasioning a piece in one of the few remaining print magazines or newspapers, as if these were properly political ends. The displacement of political conflict to the terrain of networked media has the perverse repercussion of perpetually expanding the topography of struggle, even as it constantly signals the locations, intentions, and networks of those who are fighting. This expansion has thus far strengthened communicative capitalism as it feeds on accelerating crises and emergencies. It also increases the exposure and vulnerability of those engaged in active protest and resistance on the ground. No wonder the diversion of cute cat photos is so welcome. Some readers will no doubt disagree with me. They will want to emphasize all sorts of tools and apps that enable activists to coordinate and get their messages out there, as if media politics today were a politics of messages rather than one set in the decline of symbolic efficiency. Most likely, they will point enthusiastically to sites like Move On, a US-based site that coordinates fundraising, petition, letter, and fax campaigns for liberal and left causes, and underplay the far-right and white supremacist message boards. They may extend the heroic, outsider ethic of the hacker into the practices of bloggers, as if the setting and subjectivities had remained the same, as if the last decades of networked media had not configured the users. Other readers will assume I'm a Luddite or technophobe and thereby avoid taking up the harder task of thinking through the disadvantages, costs, and challenges the turbulent media environment poses for an anti-capitalist politics oriented toward economic and social equality. It's easier to set up a new blog than it is to undertake the ground-level organizational work of building alternatives. It's also difficult to think through the ways our practices and activities are producing new subjectivities that may well be more accustomed to quick satisfaction and bits of enjoyment than to planning, discipline, sacrifice, and delay, subjectivities that may well eschew equality as an end. Most readers will likely find my analysis here too bleak, despite the fact that I said from the outset that critical media theory should forswear effective offerings of hope and reassurance. These readers will emphasize contingency and the unexpected. After all, we can't predict the future, it's an open field of potentialities. I think tendencies are stronger in some directions than they are in others. The question, then, is whether a media politics that does not merely circulate contributions is possible, or if a politics capable of overturning communicative capitalism must emerge via a cut through the circuits of drive. The former course of media politics ranges from the cultivation of critical media competencies and local, face-to-face, street-level activism to the organization of covert cells of communist hackers. Each of these attends to practices of subjectification that might work against the limbo of whatever being. The latter course of the cut-through drive also needs the skills of the communist hackers and the local ties of street activists, although it could result from completely unpredictable crises or from the amplification of the effects of predictable disturbances cascading through complex networks. So even if the revolutionary overthrow of communicative capitalism seems like the remnant of 20th century fantasies, although it shouldn't, The reality of extremes, turbulence, and destruction in the reflexive circuits of complex networks cannot be avoided. It can at best be channeled, reinforced, and retroactively determined in directions less likely to exploit and immiserate. Both courses, alternative media politics and the cut-through drive, need critical media theory. But neither should presume it's sufficient. As long as politics is reduced to communication, it will remain captured.